This is another iRaw podcast.
Hi, welcome to Storytelling Animals. I'm your host, Dayton Martindale. And as regular listeners know, we've been doing a series about the social, environmental, and other issues with car dependency and how much time we spend on roads, driving around, and all the negative impacts of that and how it might be fixed. The other episodes in this series have dealt a bit more with the problems. Toward the end, we often gesture towards solutions, but today I wanted to dig a bit more into public transit as a solution and talk about how to actually reduce vehicle miles traveled, VMTs as they're called. And so my guest today is Kevin Shen. He is a policy analyst and advocate with the Union of Concerned Scientists in their Clean Transportation Program. And we talk about some of the obstacles faced by public transit in the United States, what sorts of policies might help us overcome them. And then we also talk about something that is, not directly related, but certainly part of this problem of too many vehicles on the road going too far, which is large vehicles, think buses, trucks, delivery vans, emergency vehicles, and how those might be decarbonized as well, because that's another thing that Kevin researches. This is bittersweetly now the last month of Storytelling Animals, at least for the foreseeable future. I am starting a graduate program in environmental studies at the University of Colorado Boulder at the end of August, and the podcast and the associated book club will be going on at least a several months long hiatus. I don't know exactly whether and when it will be launched, if at all, but yeah, I just want to take this moment to say thank you to whether this is your first episode or your 49th, 48th, 47th, whichever episode this is. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much to those who have shared it with friends on social media, who have supported this podcast on Patreon. I will be pausing your Patreon payments at the end of the month, so you won't be paying me for nothing. And if you don't yet support this podcast on Patreon, now could be the perfect time to go to patreon.com/storytellingpod and sign up to basically, in effect, just give me a 1 month payment before I pause them. Just to, I don't know, if you've enjoyed this podcast, it could be a nice gesture. And also, if any of you do that, it's going to make it more likely that I come back with this podcast in the future, if I know that there are people out there who are going to be willing to listen and support it. Although, of course, I will let Patreon subscribers know before I restart their payments. While I am on hiatus, the best way to keep up with me will be either on Twitter, if it's still around, or via my newsletter, which I'll send out every, 2-3 weeks or so, with book recommendations, articles I've read, any updates on my own writing, if I'm doing that, or important news in the world of climate, ecology, and animals. So, without further ado, here is Kevin Shen. Hi, I'm here with Kevin Shen, a policy analyst at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Kevin, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. So for those who aren't familiar, maybe we could just start with what is the Union of Concerned Scientists, and how do you describe your role?
Yeah, thanks so much for asking that. So we're the Union of Concerned Scientists. We are a science-based advocacy organization, and we fight for a sustainable and just world out there. We actually started in the 60s. There's a couple MIT scientists who are really concerned, that's where the concern comes from, concerned about nuclear proliferation. But since then, we've moved to advocate on a whole host of different issues, from climate change to healthy democracy and we still do a bunch of nuclear security kind of work as well. I'm a policy analyst on our clean transportation team. We make sure that our transportation system is sustainable and just. A lot of that focuses on things like electrification, whether it's like passenger cars, trucks, and buses. And also we're expanding our work in how transit and other transportation strategies reduce vehicle miles traveled and ultimately get us to the place we want to be, where people can move freely, can breathe freely, and also the climate is not as much of a crisis as it is right now.
Mm-hmm.
So happy to be here. Oh, a couple other things about us. We have over 500,000 supporters out there across the country and across the world. But a lot of our power comes from, we have what is known as what we call our science network, where we recruit scientists, engineers, social scientists are also included in that, and basically allow people to expand beyond their deep technical expertise and give scientists the tools to use their voice in ways that can push policymakers towards the right direction. So that's a little bit about us.
Cool. And I'm curious if you want to share any of your personal background, how you became interested and involved in addressing these questions of clean transportation.
Yeah, totally. So I was originally an engineer. I thought that I was really scared about climate change. There's one moment in my childhood where I went to the science museum and, the graph kept going up, talked about all the horrors of what a warming world would be. And so I was always interested in trying to solve the problem. Initially, I thought the route to that was mostly technical, so I pursued engineering. I thought that, okay, if you could invent the right thing, if you could do the right whatever design of something that all the problems would be solved. Lo and behold, I realized that the technical part of solving this world, climate change, is only one portion of the problem. And so I moved in towards doing more policy-facing work, trying to push decision makers who shape our world to do better. In terms of how I do a bunch of work on transportation, and so my current interests, or my current kind of portfolio, I focus on state-level policy in the Northeast, from Maine to Virginia. And I work on things ranging from truck and bus electrification. There are these bus electrification standards that are coming out of California that I'm working on, as well as I'm helping shore up our campaign, which we're calling focused on equitable mobility. And that focuses on moving people around in a just and sustainable way.
Cool. So yeah, you wrote a blog post last year for Union of Concerned Scientists, UCS, I'll call it from now on, about how transit helps the climate. And I think, yeah, I mean, probably maybe some people are familiar with some reasons, not with all. So maybe let's just start with the basics. Why do we need better transit if we're going to help mitigate climate change?
Yeah. Thanks. So, I think a lot of people kind of have this association that transit is good for the climate, but it's kind of vague about how that is all connected. And so, for one, we need better transit to be able to move around. That's one huge purpose of the transportation system, is to connect each other with the places, people, things that you need to thrive. But in terms of why transit specifically, a lot of people, when we're talking about climate change, we know that transportation is one of the biggest sectors of greenhouse gas emissions out there. And so we really need to decarbonize the transportation system. And it's also a huge problem that is very difficult to budge. I guess over the course of the past couple decades, there have been major advances in sectors like the power sector, things like that. But transportation, the greenhouse gas emissions from that sector have just been kind of staying constant. And so one of the reasons for this is because the amount that people are driving their personal cars just keeps going up and up. We got more people driving their cars more and more. And so transit is an important strategy to help us do the same thing to get to where we need to go in a more efficient way. Yeah, I think we can start there.
Cool. So yeah, you said a more efficient way. Certainly, taking a bus or a train is more efficient than driving around a gas powered car, or especially a gas powered truck or SUV. Um, what about like personal electric vehicles? Those are probably the most visible, or at least most talked about way of decarbonizing the transportation sector. And I do think it's very good to have electric vehicles, and for people who are driving, if switching to EVs as fast as possible is great. But what can transit do that EVs can't?
Yeah, and I think exactly what you're saying. There's a lot of people focus on electric vehicles. We do a lot of work on electric vehicles, which is like, it's not like they're a very important part of decarbonizing the transportation system, no doubt. But I think what is missed a lot of the times is that we need a both and kind of approach when addressing the climate impacts of the transportation system. As I was saying, the transportation system is a huge behemoth of a sector to decarbonize. And so just like one strategy, like electrifying our vehicles, is not gonna get us all the way there. So there's a false dichotomy between EVs and other climate solutions, such as reducing VMT, vehicle miles traveled, by promoting transit, or things like phasing out petroleum from fuels. And it's important to note that like the opposition, the folks who don't want the climate crisis to be mitigated or have interests in that, the folks who are doing that want us to pit these strategies against each other, want us to think like, oh, is it EVs or transit? Like, we only have so much money and we can only spend it on one, or some feeling like that. But when you look at the transportation system holistically, and if you look at those state or national climate goals, there's definitely no one silver bullet, and each strategy gets us some of the way there. And so strategies like transit and reducing vehicle miles traveled, especially, one, they get people around pretty efficiently, especially if you're able to change land use patterns so that people can use transit more effectively. But also electrifying the transportation system, with all of its major climate and public health benefits, it comes with an associated demand for minerals, for manufacturing electric vehicles. It comes with investments needed in our grid to transition the fossil fuels that we use, like gasoline and diesel, transitioning that instead of being burned in an internal combustion engine, transitioning that to electric sources. And so both of these strategies together, when you reduce VMT, you can actually reduce a lot of that kind of demand, reduce a lot of these things that are notable barriers towards electrifying the transportation system, and that makes it easier to mitigate the climate crisis. On the other side too, though, transit helps people get around, and the car is more dependent on being able to afford the high cost of car
Yes.
ownership. It is much more individualized, and all those kinds of things, where transit, not only does it help with the climate, but also helps with getting the transportation system to actually connect all people to the places they need to thrive. So that's something that like the other solutions don't touch as much on.
Yeah, I think that kind of justice or equity element is important. So,
Mhm.
what would you say is kind of the state of public transit? Like, how are we doing in the United States? I know, especially since the pandemic, but even before, there's some room for growth.
Yeah, it's a very timely question to ask, because right now things are looking kind of dire. But it's not just, as you said, it's not just now. This has been in the making for a while. And so currently, transit agencies across the country are facing a fiscal crisis. Throughout the pandemic, transit had gotten a lot of big infusions of funding from federal stimulus funding, and that helped a lot to help transit exist throughout the pandemic and get our essential workers where they needed to go. As it was shown, like transit was still essential for all of us to be able to thrive in our society because it got a lot of essential workers to keep us all running. And so right now, these agencies are facing a really deep fiscal crisis. And though, of course, transit as it is would benefit from greatly expanded service that would help a lot more people get around. There's what are known as network benefits where, like, with more transit service, more people start using it, which makes it easier to have more transit service, like that kind of positive reinforcement. But right now, if you talk to transit rider unions across the country who are fighting for systems in their area, people are just fighting to prevent service cuts. And these service cuts that could result in a really dangerous negative feedback loop. A lot of transit agencies, in order to fill the gap, debating things like service cuts, debating things like fare increases, things like that, which really kind of make the transit system less effective, less accessible for a lot of people. But it's kind of the state that they're in. So it's really a tough picture right now.
Yeah, I think you mentioned how that's kind of a vicious cycle where if the service is worse, fewer people will use the transit, and then there'll be more cuts because there's not people on it. And so, who, in terms of how to break this cycle, whose responsibility is it, or some combination of like federal, state, local governments? How does transit funded? Who decides, whether services are cut or expanded? How does that work?
Yeah. Notoriously, transportation planning funding is such a black box. And I don't know, some part of me wants to say, like, almost purposefully so. But when we talk about the dangers of car dependence, for instance, we often just invoke the long history from the 50s with the construction of the interstate highway system. And that's like, and if we talk about car dependence, it's a very like broad and could be like a kind of an abstract feeling kind of concept. But what's obscured in that is that all these decisions to perpetuate this reality are happening right now in state DOTs or metropolitan planning organizations. And these are the folks who funnel a lot of federal dollars as well as state funding and decide whether or not, we're going to build a new highway project, we're going to build a new transit project, or a new bike pedestrian safety effort, or anything like that. And so these organizations control a lot of like the billions of dollars that go towards transportation planning and transportation investments. And these are the places that make the decisions that shape our current reality. And one other thing that I want to mention is that the most recent, at the federal level, transportation funding is decided in like 5-year increments on these quote unquote like surface transportation reauthorization bills. I think usually people just call them the infrastructure bill. But this comes every 5 years, and the most recent one was known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and that passed in 2021. It passed an unprecedented amount of federal funding for transportation in general, but the breakdown between how much is spent towards expanding car-dependent infrastructure versus transit, that largely remained the same. The next opportunity for that coming from that is in a couple of years, but as of now, all these federal dollars are flowing towards states and local municipalities, regional metropolitan planning organizations, and they actually have a lot of discretion with how they use this funding. Currently, the funding amount is like around $643 billion throughout the 5 years of the current transportation bill. And states and regional governments are actually allowed to quote unquote flex a lot of the funding that's designated towards highways or car dependent infrastructure, and they're allowed to flex that to use for transit projects if they choose to do so. States like Vermont use this to provide rural transit services, while states like New Jersey or California flex funding for transit improvements like new train cars or new services and things like that. But in order to make any of that happen, it's all in the hands of state and local decision makers in order to make transit or reducing vehicle miles traveled a priority. So the funding flow is like notoriously very complicated, but there are specific places that are particularly useful for people to hear, for decision makers to hear what people actually want.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, you mentioned, I think, Vermont, New Jersey, and California. Are there any other either states or localities that maybe are pursuing some particularly promising initiatives to include or to improve transit that you think should be models, or other policies that maybe no one's doing yet, but that you think they should be doing?
There's definitely a lot of policies that nobody's doing yet, but I think one promising one like case for hope recently has been when transportation planners and engineers make decisions about what projects to choose or not, since like a couple of decades ago, transportation, like federal transportation funding, has been tied towards like an ethos that you must make decisions based off of objective kind of criteria that you can measure, a couple metrics, things like that. Usually this includes things like safety or reducing congestion. But states like, I think one of the first states to try and use this in a different way was Colorado, which around 2 years ago came out with this quote unquote greenhouse gas measurement rule that it basically required all transportation projects that go through the transportation planning process. They have to do an analysis on the greenhouse gas emissions that are implicated in it, and then they have to add up all these projects in the plan, and it has to add up to a decreasing timeline or decreasing goals that Colorado is setting. And so basically, like traditionally, you don't have to think about climate change when making transportation project decisions, and Colorado was one state where they made that happen. They were like, oh, we actually need to be thinking about this. This is one of the major impacts of the transportation system. Minnesota did a similar thing that passed in their most recent state transportation bill. And then now at the federal level, they're considering, albeit like a weaker version of a similar rule that would require state DOTs and MPOs, metropolitan planning organizations, to consider greenhouse gases in all the transportation project decisions they make.
Okay, so if they're deciding whether to put money toward a highway expansion or toward a bus system expansion, one of the factors they consider has to be the emissions impact. Is that?
Yeah, and in Colorado, it's not just they have to consider; they have to add it all up, and it has to go down.
Okay.
Whereas some of the other rules could be a little weaker. So.
That sounds like it is something they should be doing.
Yeah.
Yeah. What are some things that? Well, okay. I'll start here. I currently live in Detroit. Although at least I'm moving in about a week, but I currently do. And the bus system here, which I'm pretty reliant on, is often not very reliable. Buses that are scheduled won't show up. Buses will be late. And my understanding is that at least one factor here is there's, both in Detroit and in some of the surrounding counties, a pretty significant driver shortage. And the drivers simply aren't paid very well. And so it's not an attractive job, and they have trouble, I guess, hiring and retaining drivers, is my understanding. I was reading some of what you were writing, and it sounds like this is a widespread problem, not having enough bus drivers. Is this, yeah,
Mm.
what can be done about that? Or is this something you're paying attention to?
Yeah, definitely something that we're keeping our eye on. Um, it's been like, I think a lot of folks, when they think about transit or fighting for better transit, it's just like, oh, like more money would be great. But also this, like the operator crisis has been like one of like of the other very thorny problems that has been plaguing the industry. And so this is definitely something that's been well known in the transit industry for a long time, which is that you need a commercial driver's license in order to drive a bus. But a lot of the other jobs that come with with that license that you could get with that license, for instance, truck driving or things like that, um, are usually a lot more lucrative than than the transit industry. And so because of that, the transit being a bus driver for a transit agency has been a really tough. It's been really tough to recruit bus drivers for this job. Some other aspects, there's many aspects towards this. One of them is being able to pay drivers more. That's like the baseline of being able to attract more people to apply for the roles. But also there's been conversations going about the quality of bus driver jobs, thinking like things like, oh, like even just like being able to have a convenient bathroom on
Hmm.
your route shift and things like that. I remember hearing folks in Maryland were talking about that. But also, like, there are like many things with the everyday of bus driving, things like what your shift timing is. And, one of the problems for bus drivers is split shifts. So, like, a lot of times transit agencies plan a lot of service around rush hours when people are commuting for 9 to 5 jobs, and because of that they have more service in the morning and in the evening, with a lull in service in the middle. And because of that, the way they time out some people's shifts is that they have to, um, like, you have to come in for 2 4-hour shifts just like twice in a day. And like understandably that
Hmm.
kind of sucks. It breaks up your day. It's kind of hard to plan out your life, and if you got family and stuff like that, it just adds to your commute time. So there's a lot of quality of life things that I know that transit agencies are considering. But I think like one of the biggest things is that transit bus operators are paid through operations funding. in and so in transit funding lingo, there's two worlds. There's operations funding and capital funding. Operations funding you can use to pay for bus driver wages, for more service, maintenance, those kinds of things. While capital funding is dedicated for things like new buses, new rail lines, new anything like that. And so in at the federal level and at the state level, a lot of transit funding is like dedicated towards this capital funding because a lot of people want a new bus line because it looks really great. It's also just like legitimately quite exciting to have something new like that. But what comes with that is very under recognized is that new investments come with even larger commitments to operate new service line, new train lines, or anything like that. And so, one of the big conversations in policy circles is um, how we can increase the share of operations to capital funding, because a lot of the times, like, agencies can be hamstrung for operations funding while they have a lot of capital funding, and the amount that you can transfer between both of those pots of money is very minimal. So that is also one reason, like, it's related to the operator shortage because their wages come out of operations funding. It's all entangled, but that's also another place where you can see improvements.
Cool. So, from a climate perspective, like we talked about, buses and rail are typically going to be cleaner than, driving alone in a gas-powered car. But,
Mm-hmm.
a diesel bus is still emitting greenhouse gases. How, what are some things that can be done to decarbonize public transit?
Yeah, yeah, exactly what you said. like the carbon emissions of a diesel bus kind of depend on how many people wind up riding it. But in terms of other ways, like there is like a huge effort towards electrifying transit buses and rail out there. Transit buses were actually like one of the first kind of applications of electrification of medium and heavy duty vehicles, because their like procurement processes and everything were like a lot easier. The application was one of the first applications that electrification seemed like very viable. So there's been many efforts towards electrifying transit buses, which would drastically reduce emissions. There's a federal grant program called the Low to No Emissions Program that provides funding to agencies specifically for this. They just came out with their announcements of who got the funding for that recently. Unfortunately, that program includes fossil fuels like propane and natural gas, and like 20% of what it is of the funding dedicated to it, and we're fighting to try and reduce that amount. But I think electrifying our existing transit buses is one way to like do the win-win, where like, you know, you have both investments in transit as well as you're investing in making it even more climate friendly strategy. And I would also say that electrifying buses, it's not just like one technology. It's like a slew of different technologies, and like kind of suiting the application in different cities and places around the country. So for instance, like I know San Francisco and I think like Boston, unfortunately, just got rid of a lot of them. But instead of huge battery powering your bus, trying to charge at the beginning or ends of routes, some transit agencies consider things like trolley buses, which are, I don't know if you've seen like those buses with the little antennas on the top and they link up to the cables. Like that is like you can electrify a route very quickly and very feasibly with that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of different technologies. I think like some folks in California are doing things with hydrogen fuel cell. So there's a lot of different technologies to help decarbonize the way transit is run. So that's one big.
Cool. I was reading an article a couple months ago, I think it was in Vox, that was kind of making the case that there is sometimes a tension between electrification and improving reliability and coverage of bus networks, that at least some localities, are electrifying, but at the cost of, to save money, they're also reducing coverage. So is this tension real? Is it possible to pursue both goals at once? Or what are there trade-offs that we should pay attention to? Or what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think can't deny it. Definitely the tension is out there, but I think it's a harmful tension for a lot of folks who are advocating for mitigating climate change and trying to reduce the most harmful effects of that. I think like what we know is we need both. What we know as well is that the pots of money that fund both of these things, they can come from different places, things like that. They do not necessarily have to be competing. And also, we do know that some of the huge pots of money that are shaping the transportation system are things like highway funding. And like, it's literally orders of magnitudes greater than the funding that is put in towards things like electrification and things like that. And so I think like it's a mistake to be like, oh, service versus electrifying buses or anything like that. I think also one thing to note is that buses make up a quite small portion of vehicles on the roads compared to like all the personal cars people drive in, or trucks that are out there hauling our goods around and things like that. And so like we don't have to focus solely on electrifying the buses. That's not the end all be all. There's also a lot of other things that we need to electrify out there too. Um, but yeah, I think just generally it pains me to see electrification and transit advocates pitted against each other when in the end we need to be rowing in the same direction in order to address climate change.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. That I don't know, they both need to happen, and there is money for it that's going in other places, so that it shouldn't be those two pitted against each other. Um, I
Mhm.
think, yeah, next question would just be that, as you mentioned, transit helps people get around often who either can't afford cars or for whatever reason,
Mm.
transit is the easier way to get around. But sometimes, anyway, transit is expansion of transit can be linked to gentrification or other things. So, how do we make sure that
Mm.
expansion of transit is done in a just way that sort of helps the people who most need it?
Yeah, yeah, that's a. Well, I'm glad you're asking this question. You're in it, Dan. So expansion of transit, especially when you're thinking like new rail line or things like that, can come with significant kind of land use impacts. Like a new train station can definitely be associated with things like displacement and things like that. Um, a lot of transit advocates are cognizant of this and are coming up with different ways to try and mitigate these impacts. But it's important to note first that yeah, and like in a lot of communities, like new things like a transit system or like new bus line or things like that, though like would be so beneficial. Like if it's not geared towards the communities in place, then if these transportation investments are not for the communities that already exist in these areas and are instead for like attracting new, more wealthy residents to an area or anything like that, then that's exactly what will happen, and that's exactly what people fear. Um, so I think like one the baseline way of doing of or the foundation for ensuring that this doesn't happen is meaningful public engagement. And so like transit transit efforts can indeed change the game for a community, but must include communities at the table. And this like if done wrong, this is like just a signal of displacement, especially for rooted Black and Brown communities. And so meaningful public engagement, we're talking like not just like one public hearing at a random time of night. People can't even get there because the bus service doesn't even
Right.
get them there on time or anything like that. We're talking actually meeting people where they're at. We're talking about diverse ways, robust kind of diverse ways of including people, going to their communities, um, going to bus stops and surveying bus riders about their needs, things like that. And there's a lot of talk in transit planner world about what it means to go beyond the bare minimum that's required in federal law of the checkbox exercise of public involvement and go beyond that towards something that actually engages the community. So that's one thing. And then another like policy oriented kind of way of ensuring things like this don't happen are folks talk a lot about this term transit oriented development, where around a bus stop or a train station, like let's try and get some businesses there, it'll boost the local economy, yada yada yada, things like that. Um, and that is indeed like a benefit of transit. What is necessary when doing any kind of effort like that, I think like people like start adding like an e at the beginning of TOD to make it equitable transit oriented development. Um, there are policies that you can put in place, anti-displacement measures that can help existing community members actually get the benefits of the investments that come to town. And so there are policies, but in the end, um, making sure that communities are at the table when you're making changes to their community, that's like one of the fundamentals of transportation
Mm.
justice. Like if you're allowed to if you can kind of self-determine what your community looks like, that's what we're all looking
Mhm.
for. um,
Yeah, and I think often when we talk about transit, we're either implicitly or explicitly thinking about urban areas. Do you see much potential
Mm.
for transit policy or other ways of reducing vehicle miles traveled in more like suburban or rural areas?
Mm. Yeah. And I think this is one thing that really hurts transit is people thinking like, it's just a city folk thing, or like, like, oh, like we're not New York City. Like, okay, fine. Like, there's not a lot of places in our country that are
Uh-huh.
like New York City. Fine. Um, but I think like the concept of transit, which is like relies on kind of cluster development, things like that, it like definitely applies towards rural areas. People in rural areas still have transit needs. Like there are people who cannot drive in rural areas. There is,
Hmm.
um, there are people who cannot afford cars in rural areas, all those kinds of things. And like currently, like in many areas with low transit service, all that means is they're kind of stuck in place, or have to rely on a lot of other ways of getting around. So transit definitely um, has a lot of potential in rural areas. There's also like different technologies that, or different ways that transit can be in rural areas. We're talking like things like more flexible kind of services and things like that are like not as dependent on density as like building a train line or something like that. But I think like in general, it's a really important thing to be able to make happen. The example I was saying before in Vermont, like they they decided that allowing folks who live in their rural areas to get around via transit was an important thing, and so they flexed their highway funding for it, and now they have one of like a very nice rural transit system compared to what it is, and it could always use more, of course, but um, I think that's something that is largely under recognized and glossed over, as well as like when you're talking about trying to get support for transit out there at the federal level, like we need rural areas to be on board with this in order to make it happen. And so that's also another reason to explore more of what transit looks like in rural areas and make it a real thing so that those folks aren't left behind.
Cool. So yeah, I thought maybe with the last 10-15 minutes or so, we could pivot to trucking. You
Yeah.
you write about and research the electrification of medium and heavy duty vehicles. You mentioned earlier that includes buses, but just kind of so people know what you're talking about. What types of vehicles does this include, and what doesn't it include?
Yeah. Um, yeah. There's all this lingo out there in transportation world. So when people say medium and heavy duty vehicles, they say it's like it's based on this vehicle class thing, which is about how heavy the vehicle is.
Okay.
And so um, the category of medium heavy duty vehicles includes things from like we're not talking about your Ford F-150s, but the level above that, the F-250 that are used for a lot of like work trucks and things like that. That's the smallest, and then we're going through towards like this thing also includes things like delivery vans, talking about all those Amazon delivery vans that are roaming
Okay.
around. We're thinking about like emergency vehicles, fire trucks, ambulances. We're talking about other step vans that are used, box trucks that are like think like the things that you might rent for moving, but like a lot of companies use that for their daily operations. And then all the way up to like we're talking those long haul semi tractor trailers that go across state lines, things like that.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of different vehicles and like that are included in this category, but it's just all those big vehicles.
Okay. And so, there are certainly a lot fewer of these types of vehicles than there are, personal cars. But you've pointed out that the impacts are disproportionate, both on the climate and also air pollution. So why do these vehicles matter?
Okay, why are these medium and heavy duty vehicles important? So They do comprise only 10% of the vehicles on US roads, but heavy duty vehicles contribute 28% of greenhouse gas emissions because, they're bigger, they emit more per mile, but also a lot of these like commercial kinds of vehicles get driven a lot more than, what you might think for a personal car.
And is that transportation emissions or road emissions?
Ooh, yeah. We're talking about road emissions.
Okay.
So 10% of the vehicles on the road, but 28% of the greenhouse gas emissions on the road.
Got
That's
it.
what I mean. Yeah. Besides that, though, they're also responsible for 45% of the nitrogen oxide emissions on the road and 57% of the PM2.5, or this is like fine particulate matter emissions on the road. And so they have an outsized greenhouse gas impact. And also, something that comes up, especially with medium and heavy duty vehicles, is that the diesel exhaust that comes from these vehicles has significant public health concerns as well. And so, electrifying these vehicles, you get the double whammy where you can help mitigate climate change, as well as reducing all the serious health impacts that come with harmful air pollution.
And yeah, you have some maps on the UCS website which show that a lot of this air pollution is disproportionately in communities of color.
Yeah, definitely. Long legacy of environmental racism that makes that happen.
Mm-hmm. So what are the technologies at our disposal for decarbonizing these medium and heavy duty vehicles?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There are. So when we're talking about electrification, especially for medium and heavy duty vehicles, there's a lot of just battery electric vehicle technologies that are out there, ready, being manufactured by vehicle manufacturers. And we can expect to see that these technologies you're gonna increasingly see them on the roads more and more in the next couple of years. There are.
And maybe before we move on from that, is it a problem that are they going to have to stop and charge all the time, or what is the range on these? Are these obstacles, or at this point have they been mostly overcome that they're not going to be a huge issue?
So I want to find this number for you, which is real quick, that there are, in North America, there are over 200 different models of these medium and heavy duty vehicles that electric medium and heavy duty vehicles. That's a lot. And when we're talking about that, when we talk about medium heavy duty vehicles, we're there's a huge range of different use cases. There are vehicles that kind of, make one trip and then go back home. There are vehicles that spend days out on the road, but a majority of these vehicles, they have they call it duty cycle. That's kind of their schedule. Lasts a day, and these trucks can easily do the work during the day, come back at night, and plug into a charger at the depot and charge for the next day. Mm-hmm. And so the range on these vehicles, we're talking over 150 miles for their range. There are heavy duty long haul tractor trailers that are starting to go up to 500 miles, 600 miles of on a single charge. These batteries are huge for those ones. But across the wide range of applications, if you think if you think a classic delivery van kind of application, mm-hmm. Going back to base at night and charging for the next day of deliveries is extremely feasible. And so extremely feasible, especially in the with the ranges that are here. I think a lot of the schedule, a lot of vehicle routes are under 150 miles a day anyways. And so that's how a majority of charging will happen. There are also investments in more public, they call it DC fast charging, that will try to charge up these trucks in a jiffy on the highway corridors. And there's a large federal program called the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program that's putting a lot of investments into making these corridors ready these corridors along highways ready for more long haul applications.
Cool. And then beyond battery electric, are there other technologies you were going to list?
Yeah. The other major technology is hydrogen. Hydrogen fuel cell. We're not talking
Okay.
about burning hydrogen. It's like, there's hydrogen and then it reforms into water, and with that it releases energy to power a truck. It releases electricity. And so it's like similarly an electric vehicle, but it's the way that the energy is stored is just different. These technologies, people are optimistic about how they can provide for um, long, longer range and niche applications where a truck might have to go for a longer time or things like that. But there are also concerns with like hydrogen fuel cell infrastructure, um, with making sure that it's green, making sure that it's not just associated with fossil fuels, because a lot of hydrogen is produced that way. So there are active conversations about that. But hydrogen fuel cell is another promising technology for this.
Okay. So how do we get more buses, trucks, emergency vehicles, etc., to start adopting these technologies? You mentioned something called the Advanced Clean Truck Rule. What is that?
Yeah. Um, so currently, like the industry is kind of at a tipping point. Like the manufacturers have these technologies ready, but they're kind of like the where the market will go is a little how fast that these technologies will come is kind of up to policymakers to decide. And so one big policy that has been going across many different states to affect this is called the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule. California has the authority to issue vehicle standards like this. Only California is allowed to do this as per the Clean Air Act. Um, all other states have to abide by the federal standard. But
Huh.
California recently put out something called the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule. This would require manufacturers to sell increasing amounts of um, zero emissions trucks. We're talking either battery electric or hydrogen fuel cell and things like that. Um, this rule would require increasing sales of that and would basically just provide for the availability out there on dealers' lots so that fleets could take advantage of these technologies. Um, there's a lot of moving parts with a transition to electric trucks. And so this rule provides certainty so that folks can plan out the charging infrastructure associated with it, plan out like how many trucks will be on their how many electric trucks will be on their lots and things like that. So California adopted this rule a couple years ago, and now states across the U.S. have the authority to choose now between adopting California's rule or sticking with the federal rule. Many states have already adopted the rule. We're talking Washington, Oregon, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, and many other states right now are in the current process of considering it. I work in the Northeast, and so like I know like Maine, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, they're like literally in the process of adopting these rules to make sure that they have electric trucks on their lots. So many like states can adopt these rules. It encourages electric truck adoption, which would help not only the climate but also the associated public health benefits as well.
Hmm. And yeah, my understanding is there are similar, at least proposals with personal electric vehicles as well, where sort of by year X you have to sell, or X% of the new vehicles have to be electric. By year Y, a higher percentage have to be electric, and then eventually
Mm-hmm.
100%. Um, are there ways with, I guess, either with personal EVs or with medium and heavy duty vehicles to also make sure the older ones are replaced?
Mm. This is not my area of expertise, but
Okay.
UCS just put out a report about how the older vehicles are one of the like when you're thinking about the older vehicles, you're talking about like vehicles that emit more. You're also talking about vehicles that are owned by folks who are lower income and buy used and things like that. And so there's a lot of work to be done to make sure that those vehicles are transitioned in an equitable way.
Cool. Um, yeah, is there anything else either on medium heavy duty vehicles or on transit that you think I should have asked you about, or any other policies you want to throw out there?
Um, huh. So on the medium and heavy duty vehicles front, it's important to note that like there's a big coalition of environmental organizations who want them due to the benefits of electrification for the climate. But when I'm talking about the public health impacts, we're talking about specifically things like environmental justice. And so, like, when you're thinking about like a lot of these medium and heavy duty vehicles, we got like the proliferation of Amazon warehouses, like across the country. They're popping up all over the place. And with that comes associated truck traffic, comes associated diesel particulate emissions right now,
Mhm.
and those are concentrated in near black and brown communities that are already like bearing the host of a bunch of different burdens. And so um, it's important that when we're talking about electrification of these trucks and buses, that we're also bringing in, or that we're also focusing on the way that these emissions are distributed because of the long legacy of environmental injustice that is associated with these vehicles as they are right now. Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe on that note, you mentioned that part of your job description, I think, is advocate, or at least on the website it is. And what are, some of the opportunities for advocacy, either through Union of Concerned Scientists or other orgs in this realm?
Yes, definitely. So for us, if you're a scientist, like please join our science network. We'll be able to connect you with tools for advocacy, how to testify at a public hearing. We can help you organize your scientist buddies to do the same. We can give you all the tools you might need. For everyone else, like we also have, please sign up for our newsletter. We don't send that many emails, but if you go to ucsusa.org, you'll be able to find out all the things that we're doing, all the events that we're putting on, and the opportunities for advocacy if you want to get involved. So,
Cool. And one last question I actually just thought of, and maybe it's not something that you work on or that UCS works on, but with personal transportation, we're talking about reducing vehicle miles traveled, right? In addition to electrification.
mhm.
And are there prospects or people thinking about reducing vehicle miles traveled when it comes to heavier duty vehicles, whether that's through like, all those Amazon vans? Is there a way to have fewer of them or make them more efficient in their routes, or uh, is that, or yeah, anything else? Is that something that is on your radar or on anyone's radar, to your knowledge?
Definitely on my radar. It's important to know that first, like it's like I said before, like it was only medium and heavy duty vehicles only being 10% of the vehicles on the roads. It's similarly like around that number for the percentage of vehicle miles traveled.
Okay.
It's like a little higher. So it is smaller, but yes, it is definitely still important. But a lot of people focus on the personal vehicles for that reason. But when we're talking about heavy duty vehicle miles traveled, like we're talking about business decisions for route choice and things like that. So it's a little different of a ball game, but there are different ways that to reduce um, that people are thinking of. This is like very much more of an emerging kind of space that people are thinking about. But like things like people have proposed cargo bikes and more efficient route planning, as you said, and things like that to reduce vehicle miles traveled. Um, there are policies. One of them that's coming out of South Coast Air Quality Management District in California, which would encourage warehouses to think about their emissions both from an electrification standpoint as well as how many miles traveled that are associated with a warehouse. Um, but yeah, I would say that that's a that's like a next frontier kind of thing. We definitely got to be working on that too. So yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks so much. Is there anything you want to add? about any of this?
I think I'm good. Dave. Thanks so much for having me here. It was fun to talk.
All right. Yeah, really appreciate it, Kevin. I learned a lot, and yeah, I'm excited to share this episode. Thanks so much for listening. That was Kevin Shen of the Union of Concerned Scientists. In the episode description, I've included a link to some of his blog posts about transit and about decarbonizing medium to heavy duty vehicles, so you can check those out if you're interested in learning more. And yeah, if you want to like, subscribe, share this podcast, I would be grateful. And if not, I'm still grateful that you made it this far. Hope you have a great day.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.